Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. Well, as we expected, America elected a New Yorker as our next president. It just wasn't the New Yorker we all expected. Donald Trump's victory to become our 45th president, and he will be our president, even if Hillary Clinton got more than 2 million more popular votes while losing the Electoral College, came after a campaign of vilification, denigrating Mexicans, Muslims, disabled people, women, Jews, military commanders, Gold Star families, the network of international alliances, trade deals, and assorted other things we think of as baseline to what it means to be American. But it was also a campaign that trapped into a visceral sense of grievance based on growing economic inequality, the loss of good-paying manufacturing jobs, especially in the Midwest Rust Belt, and the opportunity to send a message to the long-standing political ruling class that enough is enough. It tracked similar throw-the-bums-out messages that have resonated from Great Britain with the Brexit vote to leave the European Union to the Philippines, where President Rodrigo Duterte has launched a reign of terror that marks the emergence of a strongman leader. We count on the fact that our institutions, even with one-party Republican control in Washington, can withstand the authoritarian threats that have stained Russia, Turkey, Venezuela, Hungary, Egypt, and so many other places in the globe, with the French election up next year when the anti-immigrant National Front candidate could win. I draw some solace, and maybe it's a thin reed, that Trump really doesn't seem to believe anything beyond his own indispensability. Early signals are mixed. He seems to be walking back some of his most extreme calls for mass deportations and barring Muslim immigration, but his early appointments include some hard-right names for Attorney General, the Department of Education, and the Health and Human Services, and his chief advisor in the White House itself, the main propagandist for the alt-right and its bigoted rhetoric. Democratic hopes to take the U.S. Senate and the New York State Senate were dashed as well, with policies to benefit urban centers facing tough sledding. It has left both parties reeling. The Republicans trying to deal with the rise of Trumpism, which succeeded despite his rejection of much Republican leadership and orthodoxy, and the Democrats warring left-leaning and more moderate wings, wrangling over their direction after an election that they fully expected to win. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Well, it seems that arc is longer than we had hoped, but I, for one, still believe he was correct. As an acrid political season gives ways towards the prospect of an acrid governing year, we're joined by 4 New Yorkers to talk about what it all means beyond screwing up traffic on 5th Avenue at 56th Street. Leticia Remauro is the president and CEO of Staten Island's Devon Agency and a veteran Republican operative. Gerson Borrero is editor-at-large at City and State. Heath Brown is assistant professor of public policy at John Jay College's Department of Public Management and the CUNY Graduate Center. And Michael Benjamin is the associate editorial page editor at the New York Post. Leticia, let me start with you.
Oh.
You're based on Staten Island.
I am.
Staten Island went for Trump.
Yes, it did.
What happened? Why were we all so surprised?
Well, I think that we were surprised because what we're not realizing is that, the political correctness of this, of the media, of leadership, of educators, stopped people from answering the poll questions honestly. Quite frankly, we're told we can't say this, don't say that, and night after night, the media on television basically called Trump supporters deplorables. So when they were asked the question of whether they were going to vote for Hillary or Donald Trump, they lied. I think, and I wrote this early on in February when everybody was just getting into the race, that Trump was somebody to watch out for, because what he was doing was he was using social media, and he was actually connecting with people on social media by saying the things that people were saying on social media. If you read social media prior to him getting into the election, people said straight out, we are tired of the status quo. We don't want Jeb Bush. We don't care. We had 2 Bushes. We don't want any more Bushes. We don't want Hillary Clinton. They wanted Bernie Sanders. That's who the people were talking about in the Democratic
I know we're going to come back to this, but you actually think Sanders would have been a stronger candidate.
Oh,
than Clinton.
100%. Absolutely.
We'll talk about that. Michael, from your perch, also the same question. What happened?
I agree with Leticia. Voters tend to lie these days, I think, on polls. And polls don't always ask the proper in-depth
Well,
questions.
the only people who don't lie are editorial boards. So
Right. Oh no.
okay.
And they're very
Sorry.
fair.
And I think we also forget too that when they did the polling, you had two candidates who have had very high negatives. So it sort of became the worst of two evils. I mean, who am I going to vote for, the devil or the imp, as my parents used to say? And then it also came to the fact that Barack Obama was not on the ballot. And for many minorities and others, he was the reason why they were voting, because he offered a program of hope. Because we're in a country where if I'm a white American and I keep opening the paper and I keep seeing, number one, among whites, the life expectancy is dropping, your income is dropping, things are happening negatively to you, but then you also read other parts of the paper that other folks are, in your view, are getting greater rights. Marriage equality, things that you're not able to get in your mind, that you're suffering, and you don't see your suffering being reflected with any sort of program to lift you out of your poverty. Your region is racked with methamphetamine abuse, drug addiction, unemployment, but nobody's speaking to you and your particular pain. They're worried about black kids getting shot in Florida or in Baltimore. And so Trump began to respond to their pain, and like Bill Clinton, he felt it in a sense.
I mean, Gerson, that's kind of a good segue to the next question, which is about identity politics. There's a degree to which Hillary Clinton talked about stronger together. She was putting together the pieces of the new version of the old Democratic coalition, put together Latinos, put together blacks, put together a variety, and Trump kind of played his own identity politics to the angry white voter. What happened?
This is the 12th presidential election that this Puerto Rican, member of the Coalition of the Offended, which is every person who got a chance to vote for these two worst candidates ever. So let's be clear that this goes beyond the red and the blue and all the gibberish and nonsense of analysis that you hear now. The fact is that the media played the first irresponsible role because during the campaign of the Republican, I don't know what it was, that circus they had, that primary, in selecting their candidate, it wound up being Donald Trump, a person of no consequence, even to New Yorkers. I don't know about you, but I had no interest as a New Yorker, and about you or any of you, in Donald Trump ever. I took him as a clown, as a buffoon, as a social media person, as a person who was not in the pages, now it's social media, but he was on the pages of the tabloids. That we as a country, this is the best we could come up with.
Objection, by the way, as a former Daily News and Newsday reporter, and on behalf of my New York Post colleague.
they do have the. But in my lifetime, I'm not going to pretend to even respond.
And El Diario was a tabloid for
Exactly. So I was an editor-in-chief of that. But what can I say? We all have to live with our crosses. But the fact is that I have never seen anybody. I mean, I voted for George McGovern. If you go back to 1972 against Richard Nixon, it was incredible. He wiped the floor with us. I thought that during the course, at least in my lifetime, and the 12 elections I participated in, this is the most revolting, disgusting, nauseating kind of example of what our democracy is supposed to be. I say that with no pretense of having any favoritism, because when they say there's a 56% unfavorable rate for Hillary, I raise my hand. When they said it was 68 for Donald Trump, I raise my hand. I thought they were disgusting candidates both, and I think this nation deserved better.
Heath, give us some historical perspective here. I mean, this is kind of an ahistorical election. It's almost hard to put this in some kind of historical context.
Yeah, absolutely. This was supposed to be the election where money was going to matter. This is going to be the $10 billion election. I think I even wrote a book where I said this is going to be the $10 billion election. Money was going to determine the outcome. Who could raise more money? Jeb Bush, $5 billion. Hillary Clinton, $6 billion, $7 billion. Turned out that money didn't matter at all. And I think one of the reasons why money didn't matter at all is because we're at a low level of public trust of nearly every institution that matters, including Congress and the courts and just about everything in Washington. I think in that kind of election,
and the
trust,
media, and the media,
the media as well,
all the moderators of public discourse.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
And those that took Donald Trump as a joke.
So that when trust falls enormously, all of those things that we expect from the past, all of those lessons, all of those things that we think we could predict become almost impossible to predict because patterns change. I think that happens in an election where the electorate is just so dissatisfied with what's going on. So a candidate like Hillary Clinton, who had every qualification that it took, ended up not convincing enough people to win. I think it's because of that very low level of public trust in everything going on in Washington that you end up with this very surprising outcome on election
That's
day.
one of the points I made, and everybody jump in, is that Trump brought Nigel, what's his name? Farage, who ran the Brexit campaign in England over here. And I think he tapped into something. I think that, I obviously, from my opening, I think there's what's going on in Venezuela, what's going on in Turkey, what's going on in the Philippines, what's going on in all these countries. You have the emergence of authoritarianism, epitomized by Trump at the Republican convention, saying, only I can fix it.
Yeah, well, the thing is that Trump reflected what people are feeling right now. And I think that we're trying too hard to raise this up to some collegiate level of thought. We must debate this and figure this out and dot all the I's and cross the T's. We have changed the way we're receiving messages and how we're giving messages in the United States now. And all of us are dinosaurs. All of us up here are dinosaurs. The young people, the millennials and the younger are the ones that are driving how messages are given and received. And if you look at the pages of their social media, of their Snapchat, of the things that they're watching, there's anger. There's anger there. And so I think that what Donald Trump did was capture that anger, spend no money doing it, which pissed off the media, all of the publications and all of the news channels. And he just regurgitated that anger and he touched so many people. And to think that we could really have a debate about, what went wrong? Was it Brexit? What is it? This, was it that? No, it's the people are fed up. And I think that Heath, you said, you hit the nail on the head. They're fed up.
And this is one of the ironies. Just 6 years ago, the Tea Party movement arose in this country over a very different kind of ideology about individual liberty, about personal ownership and property. Those same people were involved in the Trump movement, but motivated by a seemingly different kind of ideology. I think we're in a period where ideology matters a lot and it doesn't matter at the same time because things are in such flux. So what seemed to drive, especially the Republican Party, just in 2010, just 6 years ago, seemed to not matter at all. The things that mattered a lot to them about the Tea Party ideas about individual
In fact,
liberty
some of the Tea Party
went away.
candidates got upset in Republican primaries.
Absolutely.
Some of them got turned out.
They did.
Marco Rubio was a Tea Party candidate.
Yeah.
That's how he got elected. This is the darling. This is supposed to be the Latino, super ace Republican that was going to have all Latinos voting for him. Jeb Bush with $112 million. This broke the mold. Donald Trump is a phenomenon based on the circumstances of a 24-hour news cycle that we have, or irresponsible journalists from CNN to MSNBC, and just taking him for granted or making, we thought he was a joke. Let's face it, it was too late for us to realize. Personally, talk about millennials or young people, I was with the young people. I'm not a registered Democrat or Republican. I'm independent. I wanted Bernie. I was rooting for the old man,
Me
the
too.
viejo, that old guy is who I was rooting for. He got to me like he got to the wrong. So I don't think there's that much disconnect between young people. It's a matter of ideology and knowing that the system really is rotten. And by the way, in New York State, let's not go too far, Bob. The fact is that we have a governor who 2 years ago said, I am the state. Mm-hmm. And he's a Democrat, supposedly liberal progressive. So, and I'm not buying this whole thing. I'm not drinking any of the Kool-Aid. And quite frankly, I think that young people should have come out in that election. I think that the Democrats got what they deserved because they slanted. They they maneuvered the whole process of the nomination. You all know that. That doesn't have to be explained. The people this time were ahead of the media, of all of us. I mean, we're writing and analyzing and doing podcasts and writing editorials and writing columns. Nonsense. We just got it wrong. Donald Trump beat all of us.
Michael, is the Brexit, the authoritarian, the strong man, the I can fix it, the non-ideological side of politics that seem to dominate?
Part of it, I think, was that people were just giving the whole system a finger. Because it's also sort of bipolar, because Trump managed to be elected. But then they're angry at the system, but some of them still reelected members of Congress who are responsible for there not being any real programs throughout the last 8 years of the Obama administration because of all the effort to block and deny his ability to do well for Americans. And so they're angry. They're angry at the wrong people. They vote for Donald Trump, by and large, but they reelect the same people who are part of the system that they're angry at. And so that is part of that whole disconnect that occurs. But all these things sort of go in cycles, because when Ronald Reagan was elected back in 1980, across the world they were electing conservatives across the world. So these things go in.
Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, Margaret Thatcher. It goes in these cycles. It's like there's one world virus, or everybody's tapped into the same sort of thoughts and feelings, and they act on it that way. But I think for those who, after the election, were feeling, Democrats and liberals and progressives were all feeling blue, they were wearing safety pins and hugging each other. If you remember correctly, when Obama won 8 years ago, the right they had a run on guns. Liberals and progressives want to hug each other. There's another disconnect. If you
I don't want to push this.
I
don't want to push this argument
If you
too
want to be
far.
angry, there are things you need to protect your republic. The Republicans have a way of protecting their republic in their way. The Democrats want to do it in sort of a touchy-feely way. It doesn't really get to the visceral parts of people's real anger.
But yet, this is a man who got elected promising whatever the particular people in the audience wanted to hear. All of his early moves on the wall, well, maybe it won't be a wall, maybe it'll be a little bit of a fence somewhere. Maybe we won't get rid of 11 million people undocumented. Maybe we'll only get 2 or 3 million, which is kind of consistent with what the Obama policy has been. He's got at least 3 people that are being discussed from Goldman Sachs who are going to go into the cabinet or senior White House positions. He has a long history of playing people for suckers. I mean, is that a fair analysis, or is it too early to make that? I don't know how his people, the people who voted for him, can be happy with some of the moves he's made, including this discussion about Mitt Romney as secretary.
But he did not win the popular vote. Let's keep in mind he did not win the popular vote.
She won by the largest popular vote.
Understand that. So that, not all of us have gone crazy. No matter how red the United States has turned in terms of 35 governors, and you have the Republicans, controlling. By the way, he made the swamp bigger and stronger. The swamp that he's going to drain.
Just to follow on that one point.
So I don't understand where the change is, and what is it that people misread? You tell me where people misread. If it's still the same people and the swamp has gotten stronger with people that are really evil, that are going to throw us back to the 1950s to white America, because that's what they're talking. They're talking about white America.
This talk is ridiculous. Nobody buys it.
What do you mean nobody buys it? Well, that's because you happen not to be either a woman that's offended. You probably on the majority that voted, women that were offended that he said those horrible things that he does to women, and you're okay. You voted for him because the majority of white women voted. Majority of Latinas and blacks who were offended, who understood this, voted for Hillary Clinton, and that's a reality. You're not part of the coalition of the offended. I'm sorry.
The women who went after her husband's
mistresses,
right?
You voted race over gender. You voted race over gender. Let's be clear on that.
Oh, no, I didn't vote race over anything.
Oh,
Listen,
yes, you did.
I'm just going to tell you that the reason that what we're going to see in the next couple of months or after January is people are going to start making money. And when they start making money and people go back to work, then all of a sudden,
are you guys
people are not going to have a problem
with
the Donald Trump going back on some of his promises.
The campaign is
At
over,
the end of the day, the problem that we had in this country was economic. People are not working. There are so many people out of work. People want to know that they have a secure future. We have older
and
adults,
Donald Trump
Gen Xers,
and
Gen Xers and baby boomers staying in jobs longer. And the people out here, the young people graduating from college, cannot find a job in their field because the Gen Xers have to work longer, and so do the baby boomers. What future do they have if there are no jobs? We don't make anything in America anymore. We drove it all out. Donald Trump, that's what won the election, in my opinion.
But I think Leticia's, is really on to something, though. It's about if he can put people back to work, and the fact that 1,000 Indianans may be continuing to work for Carrier Corporation in the coming months is a plus for him. Absolutely. And if he could replicate that in other ways, whether it's through the infrastructure program, wants to build roads and bridges, much like Eisenhower did, because people change their attitudes when they're all invested or they feel that they can they're doing well economically. There are many who believe, and I think Heath can share it with us. They believe the reason why civil rights succeeded in the 1950s and 60s is because Americans across the board were doing well, and so they didn't mind, in a sense, sharing the pie because there wasn't the competition. If people are working, you reduce the competition, you're not so fearful of immigrants or foreigners or anything else that's maybe a threat to you because you're doing well, your children are doing, you're prospering, and so you're less insular. And I think if Trump, and I'm an American, and I want my nation to succeed, so I accept that he's president, and I want him to be successful. If he proposes bad policies, then we have the court system, we have other elected officials to try to block what he wants to do. And so I believe in our system.
Yeah, and I think part of your answer, and I think part of to build on that is governing makes campaigning seem easy. I mean, the actual difficulty of governance, the difficulty of actually filling a cabinet with competent, hardworking people is much more difficult than in some ways getting elected. And so I think part of these different decisions that are being made about whether Mitt Romney is going to join the cabinet, whether people of different backgrounds are going to join the cabinet, is the reality that doing this is hard. And I think when on that election night, when we saw Donald Trump's face, when he found out that he won, that's what we saw. We saw the difference between debating and campaigning, which is fun in comparison to working 20 hours a day trying to create jobs where there are no jobs.
But arguably much more important, especially in a city like this, where there's a lot of people in need. I mean, they are talking about, if you look at Congressman Price, who was just named to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, it's an indication that he, in fact, does want to dismantle Obamacare, and it's not clear what they're going to replace it with. There's 20 million people who have health insurance. They're talking about privatizing Medicare, despite Donald Trump's promise, I'm never going to touch Medicare. All across the social safety net, which I think a lot of the people who voted for him, there's that famous Tea Party sign where people said, keep the government's hands off my Medicare. So, I mean, not understanding that, of course, it's a government program. There's a lot of pain that could happen from what's about to
and a lot of good. I mean, we're always afraid of what we don't know, right? Privatizing Medicare, that would be terrible. We don't want to fix things, right? We say, let it be the status quo, because if it changes, oh, God forbid. But that's what's the problem, is that it's not changing, and the people have really reacted to the fact that we're not changing things.
On Friday of last week, the lowest unemployment rates in the United States were given out under President Barack Hussein Obama. The most people working. I don't know where they get this narrative that people are dying of hunger. And there's been hunger and poverty in this capitalist system forever, since the founding of the republic. Let's get that clear. And he has improved it. Now, this was the socialist, the guy who was going to take us into communism. I got to tell you, bottom line, God has a sense of humor. He gave us 8 years. The idiot from Texas that got lost and he wound up being president, white man. Then he gave us 8 years of a brilliant black man, couldn't be more articulate and well-meaning and able to express himself and make us proud, those of us that voted for him twice. He now gave us an even dumber white man who's going to screw this country all the way. I mean, that's his bottom line. So God, thank you so much, because we will live to see it, and historians will pronounce Barack Hussein Obama as the most accomplished and brilliant president of these modern times. That's all I got to say.
Yeah, well, that was a nice racist speech you just gave.
Oh, racist?
Yeah.
You talk about racist.
I heard about two dumb white men.
You know what Mitch McConnell did? What he said that he would obstruct them? You know what the 59
you're supposed to be the party of kumbaya and peace.
No,
and you just denigrated
Okay, hold it.
Who's talking racist?
Hold it.
She voted for the white guy who wants to actually turn things back.
Hold it, Gerson, hold it. Gerson, hold it.
She called me racist.
Hold it. Okay.
I'm Puerto Rican. What are you?
I'm Italian.
There you go. So then you should know better.
I should know better than
That's right.
what?
Don't call me racist. You don't know me.
You just
let's back
denigrated
off.
people by their race.
No, what?
Right.
That's what they did to Barack Obama. What are you kidding me?
Okay,
Did he do that? Do they do that to Barack Obama now?
Let me ask
Okay.
you. Let me try to refocus this.
The hell are you talking about?
Barack Obama was blocked at every step of the way by Republicans who said on the first day that he was elected, there's that
Correct.
famous lunch, we're going to make sure he's
Right.
a one-term president.
Correct. And that wasn't because he was white.
That was probably more because he was a Democrat than because
Oh,
he
come
was,
on, Bob.
than
Come
because
on.
he was
Come
black.
on. Come on, Bob.
Do you?
Come on.
Do you
None of these
see-
people in this audience believe that. The
do you
people
see-
watching you don't believe that.
Do you see? Well, I'm certainly not discounting the racist underpinnings of the
This is
reaction.
was
CUNY.
reelected.
This is CUNY.
He was
This is CUNY.
reelected.
Majority of students are people of color. Part of the coalition to condemn. Be real, Bob, at least.
And our country was smart enough to reelect him. And they were good enough to reelect him. So I don't
And he's
buy
out
this
of the way.
racist stuff.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Donald Trump did not run a racist campaign. You must have been listening to another campaign.
Do you see the same kind of contentious? You do have a Republican, for all the electoral college victory that Donald Trump won, she has over 2 million more votes than him. The Democrats did pick up 2 Senate seats. The Democrats did pick up 6 or 8 House seats. It wasn't what they wanted to pick up. They did pick up a significant number of state legislative seats around the country. They didn't pick up enough. They expected a mammoth win. Are we overinterpreting the Republican wave?
No, no, they won.
The fact that they
They
won.
won. So they're the victors.
Are we overestimating it?
But they've been winning for
Long time.
the last years. They've been winning since 1980, in a sense.
Yeah.
The mindset, the politics have changed over the last 30 years because of republicanism, whether it's Reaganism or it's George Bush today. It was even Bill Clinton was sort of a Republican light in triangulating policies so that he could win in Republican areas. So the policies have began to change somewhat. What we're not looking at, we're forgetting too, is that because Republicans control a great number of state houses, in fact, 25 states are one party, Republican control, governor through the state legislature. And state legislatures are the ones that draw the districts for Congress. And so in a sense, they've sort of made themselves the majority party technically based on redistricting and using the Voting Rights Act to pack predominantly black districts. And in the South, they've turned the Democratic Party into minority, almost majority black caucus in many state houses, which sort of distorts our politics. And so we need to look at that. I think the Democrats, if they want to find the road back is not the White House. The road back is the State House. Winning back governorships, winning state legislatures, that's how the Democratic Party rebuilds itself at the grassroots level.
Let me ask you to follow up on that, a structural question, which is not only redistricting and how you can, how you build your political structure, all the way up to the Electoral College. I mean, we do have, what is this? The largest, the losing candidate with the largest margin since Samuel H. Tilden in 1876. There's a statue of Samuel H. Tilden outside my house on 112th Street. How much of this is a structural problem? And I do want to have a brief discussion without getting too deeply into what people think about the Electoral College. Is it time for it to go?
Yeah, I mean, the Electoral College has always provided this strange way in which we do elections, and this is not the first time and will not be the last time. And I think the possibility of actually changing the Electoral College in any significant way is a non-starter in so many different ways. And so
Because of the power it gives to smaller states.
absolutely, and I think there's very few incentives among Republicans, really, or Democrats to make any significant change. What I see, and I think this is sort of your original question was about Congress, I think that Donald Trump is going to have a very difficult time trying to pass many of his legislative proposals through Congress. I think there's going to be such enormous resistance, particularly on this infrastructure idea. I think there's going to be a very weak stomach in Congress for massive additional spending.
Yeah, but he can get a lot of Democratic votes on the infrastructure. The question is on immigration, some of the other issues where
I
have some.
I think they're unlikely to give him the money and give him a success on that. I think it's much more likely that the social agenda that's likely very unimportant, I think, to Donald Trump, but much more important to Mike Pence. I think that you're going to see those kinds of ideas on a social agenda that's been basically sitting in waiting for a number of years. That's the one that's going to be prominent in the first 100 days of the Trump administration, because that's the stuff that can come with spending almost no federal money. Any program that comes with a big federal expenditure, I think, is going to really be a non-starter in this Congress.
You know, whether the Electoral College has its merits or not, it is the land of the law. We have to accept it.
Law of the
Donald
land.
Trump is the president-elect. He will be our president. You can't change that. Hillary can get another 5 million votes, but the rules were applied. But I ask you to think about the following. Had the reverse happened, Donald Trump would be telling people to go out on the streets and tear them down. So I'm just saying, I accept it. He is the president-elect. Understand what he was saying. This system is rigged. It is rigged. And he won it.
He benefited
From the rigging.
Right.
It's flawed. But even as it is flawed, I can tell you, I have no problems with him being president. Bravo. He's going to face what he wanted. And be careful what you wish for, brother, because you're going to get it. You're going to have to govern now. And as you suggest, governing is not easy, especially with the people in the swamp being greater and more powerful. He's made them more powerful. In the cabinet picks, you can't be happy with some of the people, but I'm applauding. Bring them back in. Bring in the crazies. Bring in Rudy Giuliani, the Pinochet of City Hall.
Stephen Bannon.
Get him all the crazies, because then you're going to have to deal with them. He's going to have to manage those alligators. Those are vipers in there. So God bless them. I hope for the sake of the country that the Democrats, as you suggest, will probably on social issues move it on, that they will not do what the Republicans did to Barack Obama. I'm hoping that, because it would mean that we all suffer. But I'm going to tell you, I'm ready to enjoy this ride, because it's going to be fun.
Yeah,
because he's going to have to do things that the first people that are going to oppose President Trump are going to be the people that voted for him. Mm-hmm. Those hardcore people in rural, in the Beltway, people that were sick and tired of the black man in the House, in the White House, tired of all these progressive agendas they've made, of LGBT communities. They're tired of Jews taking over institutions. They're tired of Latinos coming over the border, they come here to work. They don't come here to steal. So all of that, he's going to have to deal with that. And he's going to not be able to keep those promises. So God bless America, because we have a democracy, and we now have bread.
I think there's an argument to be made.
He's president.
That nobody really believed when he said that. That was not why they voted for him. They voted for him.
Really?
Yes. Let me finish my thought. I think they liked what they said, because it was all part of a symbolic restoration. And I do believe race is a major factor in the restoration of when, America, it's like when people talk about how Brooklyn went downhill after 1957 when the Dodgers left. It's really the time when you had white flight. I think Brooklyn did quite well, even with the Dodgers gone. So, I think that there is a racial there's a racial animus at the core, but I think you looked at when he was grabbing women by their private parts. People didn't vote for that. They just factored that in. They judged Donald Trump on a different level because Donald Trump was the, as you so eloquently said, giving the system the finger candidate, as opposed to anything he actually proposed. Does that?
I would tend to agree with that. I think that's part of it. And plus, he was in their homes for the last 15 years. And people think they know you when you've been in their homes every other night. They think they know you. And so he's the person they knew, and they never saw him grab anybody by their whatever.
Private parts.
By their private parts. They didn't see that. That's the guy they saw. They saw a guy who was strong in getting his point across and promoting people who, in his mind, were good. And they see him trying to do that in his government. I don't think they're going to. None of them really know who Betsy DeVos is, other than which they're told she's a billionaire or married to a billionaire, or Wilbur Ross. I mean, even when you go beyond just his government.
I didn't even realize that he was alive still. I'm serious.
Yes, I didn't think so either.
He's 79. He's
No,
79, yes.
I'm serious. I didn't know that.
But the point I want to make is that his government is really no different than the last 44 governments. That were
and he's entitled to pick
that did
whoever
not
he
include
chooses.
any working class people. They were all rich people. They were all millionaires. They were all people who had made it in the system, but were able to, for those who wanted to do good, did good. I don't think it's a racist government because you've got Elaine Chao, you've got two Indian Americans who are in it. Whatever you think of Dr. Ben Carson, he's going to be in that government. And there'll be other people, the 4,000 people he has to appoint to various levels of government will not be all Klansmen or Nazis. with people who really want to serve their country. College Republicans, black, white, Latino, and Asian, will be part of that government. Then you have the permanent bureaucracy that can slowly resist things. You can't, government really is like a battleship. You can't turn it quickly.
That's
It
right.
takes time to turn.
Bill Lynch said that. May he rest in peace. That's a person here.
The one thing that we could be certain of is that the people that are going to be appointed are going to be Americans, whatever their color, whatever their heritage. And the hope is that we can stop dividing ourselves by our races or our sexual preferences or our gender.
Except that, Leticia, he ran an explicitly divisive campaign by what he did with Muslims, by what he did with Mexico, in terms of Mexican rapists that right out of the bat after coming down. His campaign was an explicitly divisive campaign.
Well, you can interpret it as that if you'd like. And I'll tell you how. I can tell you exactly how.
Please.
We went through in this country, there was a time after Pearl Harbor where Japanese were rounded up and they were put in concentration
camps. That seems to be the model.
Okay, but it was a fact and it happened because at that time, it was thought that would preserve the people of America. Donald Trump said, until we figure out what's going on with ISIS, we should stop allowing Muslims to come flooding into the country. Did he deliver the statement? Well, no. But I think I understood, and so did a lot of Americans, what he meant. You can't just open the doors to everybody and expect that Americans are going to stay.
Arguably, Leticia, he's making an explicit judgment based on somebody's religion. That's an anti-American
but ISIS is based.
He wasn't talking about ISIS. He's talking about Muslims.
And he was talking about ISIS.
We will have to wait and see if he builds the wall or a fence. We'll have to wait what he does with Muslims or not. But I'm going to tell you something. I ask you at home that are watching this here in the audience, if the person that disgusting state about where he grabbed women was a Latino, a brown person, or a black man, do you think he'd still be around? He would have been prosecuted. He would have been, after the fact, he would have been put in jail. But no, it wasn't a racist campaign. It's just that the white man got away with it.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's still accusations, which we don't know if they're true, allegations that he actually did some things to certain women that supposedly will someday, I guess, wait till he's president to sue him. But let's forget about that because it was not a racist campaign. If it had been a black man, that wouldn't have counted either. Please.
Let's talk just briefly about Stephen Bannon. What does it mean that he's put the head of Breitbart, the head of the alt-right, the white nationalist, however you want to, put him right next to his office? Reince Priebus and Stephen Bannon. It's amazing that, as somebody who's a Democrat, I was so relieved that Reince Priebus was in there. I couldn't believe it. It's like when they were talking about John Bolton or Rudy Giuliani as Secretary of State. I was saying, I can't believe I'm rooting for Rudy if that's the competition. What does it say about somebody of that ilk, if you will?
I don't know if we've ever had somebody like Steve Bannon in the White House, and I suspect that Steve Bannon is going to have a lot of trouble figuring out how to position from what he's been very good at, which is basically throwing bombs, to the position of being in the White House. I suspect that he's going to have a lot of difficulty figuring out how to act in the same way. I don't think the same kinds of tactics that were so effective to build this company. He's built a very successful media company in a time when building media companies is not the easiest thing in the world, but he's built it on a model that doesn't really translate very well into Washington politics and into governance. And so I suspect he's not going to last very long because he's not going to be very satisfied with what one can accomplish from inside the White House. I think ultimately Reince Priebus is the one who's going to make out the best of this. Mm-hmm. And I think many of the appointments that have already been made suggest that he's winning a lot of these battles.
I think you made the point.
And the vice president.
And the vice president.
Yeah, and so if Mitt Romney ultimately is chosen, I think that would be a good indication of who's winning this war already. And I think Steve Bannon is really going to lose patience with what goes on in the White House.
War. I think that when you look at the Congressman Price for Health and Human Services, you look at the National Security Advisor, General Flynn, who's, in my mind, a little bit extreme. I think that there's a significant extreme element as well as what you're looking for, a more traditional Republican element, which you have with the proposed transportation secretary, the idea of a Mitt Romney, even the guy, even the financial team, he's put in with Mnuchin, who's going to be Treasury, Wilbur Ross. I mean, those are more traditional Republicans.
True.
So let me take a question. Give us your name and give us your campus, please.
Hi, my name is Adriana Serenian. I am from the Macaulay Honors College. I'm a senior. So I wanted to touch back on the way that Trump ran his campaign. I personally did not vote for him. I was very upset after the election, the result of the election. So what came to mind to me was, Hillary's concession speech, she called for unity and that, we all really are stronger together. But how do we have a conversation with people, personally for me as a Democrat, with voters who seem to come off in a way that don't believe that all people are equal to each other? And I think that you cannot deny that his campaign was run on bigotry, hatred, intolerance, and xenophobia.
Well, I think, first of all, I want anybody to jump in, but what you can't do is not try to have that conversation. You have to have that conversation because, for better or worse, we are all Americans.
Absolutely.
For better or worse, and we share this strange little country, and we're stuck with each other. So we might as well figure out a way to deal with it. But I think it is. I mean, the level of discourse. We talked earlier about that the institutions that moderate public debate. The Congress is dysfunctional. The media is totally narrow-casting. It's compartmentalized. It's ideological. There's not 3 networks and a couple of major newspapers that moderate what we all agree on. We all go into our own little echo chambers. And how do you break out of that echo chamber?
I'm just going to say that to answer the question, I just sat here listening to one of our team here call 2 of our presidents, one of them a stupid guy, and another one, and both times he says,
This is
white
America.
guy.
I have a right to my opinion.
White guys,
Yes.
but
They are
it's
white guys.
Why is it okay
shush me,
to
Bob.
bash
Don't shush me.
Republicans? Why is it okay to bash white men? Why is it okay to bash women? Why is it okay to bash
That's Donald
religious
Trump, that one.
people?
That's Donald Trump,
Why
that.
is it okay for
That was your
that?
candidate.
But I'm sorry. I hear Catholics being taken to task regularly by people. I hear white men being taken to task by people regularly from the Democrat side. So if you're going to have this conversation, you've got to remember you have to watch the words out of your own mouth, because just because the group might not be pro-Republican doesn't mean that you have to be nasty to Republicans. They may be able to teach you something. I mean, well, I'm sorry. The Republican Party was the party of Abe Lincoln, and there are
Abe
many of us,
Lincoln. And
there are
Abe Lincoln
still
and
many
Trump have
of
a
us-
lot to say to each
Still
other.
I mean,
many
come on.
of us
Come on.
that uphold that.
What
And
about
if you're
this?
going to lump us all together, then
But you voted for him.
Then
You own
who
him.
is
You
putting
own him.
people in a box, and who is being
Absolutely.
prejudiced?
Absolutely. I put
So,
you in the box.
so
What
then
about this?
answer
What
this
about
young
this?
woman's
What
question,
about this
how you
question?
are going to start the
How you gonna-
conversation.
Well,
Because you're doing a
everybody-
bad job of it with me tonight.
Everybody has to be part of the conversation.
You happen to be still campaigning. That's why it's bad.
No, I wasn't campaigning. Never
Young
could
lady,
come.
I think, first of all, you did the right thing. You voted your conscience. You voted at the right time. You voted. Listen, me personally, I don't like Democrats. I voted independents all the time. I don't like Hillary. And yet I knew that this vote counted. And I voted not only for Hillary, but across the board I voted Democrat. That's my personal choice. Nobody forced me. What I suggest to you is, in Macaulay, that's a great program. I know what you're thinking. Do not be turned off. You need to speak to people, but start talking to people in your own party first. Never mind Republicans. Start talking to people in your own party, because there was division among you. And you have to restructure your party first, because they're totally out of touch. The division in the United States is not Democrat and Republican. It isn't one side or the other. It's much deeper. It is much deeper. You're part of the coalition of the offended. You know what that means. It's everybody from the Mexicans to women being grabbed by this obnoxious, ferocious white racists. So start talking to your party, rebuild it, get the troops out, make sure that you go to states that actually you can win the Electoral College, because it's still going to be there. Do not be disheartened, but organize your own party. Don't even bother with Republicans. They're not going to change.
My daughter, I have a daughter who just started college, And after the election, she was very upset, and she said she was afraid. Now, I'm a Democrat, and I said, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of him. We're gonna fight. We're gonna resist. We're gonna organize. We're gonna do whatever it is that we do, because that's what we do. And she said, I'm not afraid of him. I'm afraid that 60 million people voted for him. I thought it was very wise. What about that discussion, that civic discourse that she's talking about?
Well, people have to talk to each other. And I think that's been the problem. We haven't spoken to each other.
Well, what about those echo
clearly.
chambers? Can you break out of those echo chambers?
By making the effort to break out of it. I also wanted to say that we've been as African American historically, we've been in this movie before. So we've went through 45 or 40 administrations, 40 presidents, some of whom were racist, and you had Supreme Courts that said black people had no real rights. And that took time to change because people organized and talked to each other to change minds and hearts and working together. So people can't lose, who disagree with Trump, can't lose hope. We need to talk to each other, break out of the echo chambers, make sure we talk, and open your heart and talk without calling people names or castigating them.
That would be
nice.
nice.
But to open up and talk. The thing I think I fault the current president for is not in his 8 years starting a race and reconciliation conversation or commission to get this out on the table. I think if Trump wants to be smart, he should do that. Because he says black people shouldn't have any reason to fear him, then he should then lay down the gauntlet and say, look, I'm going to appoint a commission to look at race in America and how do we reconcile things and remove the various parts of the law and the structure that has caused problems for people of color so everybody can be on an even footing. And you can get this discussion out, and we can stop getting upset because somebody says there's two white men who are foolish and screwed things up, or the things that we say that can be offensive, and then people shut down and don't want to talk to each other.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say two quick things. Leadership matters, and I think Trump's vision of his leadership is going to matter a lot. I don't think he's thought about this very much in the past, because he's never been in a position of political leadership. But how he internalizes the position of the presidency is going to matter a lot. And I think he's going to address this question, whether he speaks out on these issues and how forcefully he does is going to matter a lot. The second thing I'd say is that colleges and universities matter a lot. We often think about taking students, including CUNY students, we want to encourage them to go to other countries and study abroad. I think there's a strong case to be made for other kinds of exchanges and other kinds of travel. Many people in New York haven't been to parts of the country that had voted very differently. I used to live in Virginia.
If they had, they would have seen an awful lot of Donald Trump signs, because I did travel a lot. I'm sorry, they want to try to get some more questions in.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Olchese, and I am from Queens College. And my question is, will the Trump presidency help bring Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio together as allies?
Oh, I don't think so. I think they're both looking at 2020.
And what are the implications for the mayoral election next year? De Blasio went to see Trump. Is costing the city $1 million a day to provide security, and is almost kind of using Trump to kind of cement his role as a national leader of the progressive movement. Yeah. And you've seen Cuomo do some of the same stuff. Mm-hmm.
I think Bill de Blasio should sit down. Donald Trump, I think, should call him back and say, how do you do this thing of dealing with the press? Which he doesn't. He's an irresponsible administrator. Donald Trump should not follow the lead. He's not a good leader. He's not a good mayor. And I hope that somebody...
But how does this affect the election next year?
Well, I don't know what does. We have a bunch of so-called, by the Daily News, chickens who won't stand up to this guy who really doesn't deserve to be... By the way, he didn't get a mandate either. In 2013. And I think that most people want to see some opposition within the Democratic Party to oust him. We haven't had a brave person. I hope that he's not the mayor in 2017. But if the people of New York decide him for a second term, what can he do? It's not going to improve the relationship between those two, because those two, the macho thing, it's like who's the biggest macho? And I think it really doesn't. They look like schoolyard bullies fighting each other. I don't think it's good for the state or the city. It's not a good example.
To extend that out, does Andrew Cuomo want to not leave the plane on the tarmac in Albany and actually run for president, unlike his
If he
unlike his
decides
father?
to, he wants the best of his dad, and he will not. He will go to New Hampshire, if that's.
But I mean, but do you think that he's positioning himself to run for president right now?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe
Yeah,
he is.
absolutely, absolutely. I think for him, election day, he was smiling election night. I think that I think Cuomo's a very balanced governor. I mean, is he a strong governor? Does he surprise a lot of people? Yes, but I think he's done something that people didn't imagine him to do, which was bring the state together. Republicans and Democrats right across the aisle, they very much respect him, and he's a strong leader. So I do think that he thinks that he's got a shot in 2020.
There was an unknown Republican who got 41% of the vote. Unknown, with almost $6 million. He had almost $30 million. This guy is not a strong Democrat. I don't care what anybody says about Andrew Cuomo. The fact is, I don't think that if that's the bench that the 2020 Democrats are counting on, they got a problem. I'm telling you, 41% by Rob Astorino, an unknown Republican. 41%, that's strong.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Frances Raybeau. I go to the Macaulay Honors College right now. I'm a sophomore. And I'm in this program, the Hertog Scholars, where we learn about the origin of democracy and basically justice and how that function works out in modern America. And something I was thinking about is you are all talking about the erosion of the voting rights and the Voting Rights Act. I remember reading a lot about how nobody basically reported on the lack of voting rights across the board until basically the day after the election. And I wanted to know, is we keep talking about the Democratic Party going back to this grassroots, moving, changing people's minds, et cetera. But how do we change people's minds when the only people who can actually vote in the polls time and time again are like angry white Americans?
Heath, let me ask you. I mean, as a structural question, you see what's going on in Virginia, where he tried to restore the rights of felons and of convicted felons who had served out their terms and served out their parole and probation. Is this a real structural issue? The denial, the limitations, the limits on people's ability to vote?
Yeah, I mean, sure.
I believe it is.
There have been lots of efforts. I mean, ALEC has been leading this charge to tighten voting rules.
ALEC is the business, the American legislative, whatever it is.
Yep,
Right.
exactly. And I think they've been pretty successful in a lot of state legislatures in passing these kinds of rules. And they've had impacts on individuals' ability to vote, but they've also created a very different environment for voting. And I think that's been one of the biggest changes. The idea that voting is now contentious is something perhaps that you might not be qualified for has really changed. It's also affected organizations. There have been effects on, for instance, in Florida, of the propensity of organizations to go out and try to register new voters has decreased much more so than in the past. And so the effect has been pretty profound. I think the point is right. What we're still having is very low voter turnout. And one of the questions I think for 2017 in New York is whether we're going to have record high turnout in this mayoral election because of the increased interest to the 2016 election. If that happens, if you have many more people engaged in politics, I think that's some positive thing for the democracy. Getting everyone to agree to that is a very different thing, because strategies suggest that that's not actually in everybody's best interest.
Of course, next year I think it's Virginia, New Jersey governorships, and the mayoralty, and that's basically it. It's kind of the strange off year. Yes.
Hi, I'm Natalie Giacchio from John Jay College. I have my own opinions about this, but it was not touched in this forum. Do you think that Hillary Clinton, being a woman running for president, played a major role in this election?
I do. I think I am sick in that I don't think America will vote for a woman president still. I think that she lost to Barack Obama. She lost again. Now, I guess it's easy for me to say people didn't vote for her because she was a woman, but she's tangled up in so many things. There's a lot of other reasons why they didn't vote for her. So, but then we had other women, right? We had Carly Fiorina, we had Jill Stein, we had other women running. So there's a piece of me, and I hate to do this because I don't like to compartmentalize people by their race, by their skin, by the sexual, by the religion. I don't like to do it. But there's a piece of me as a woman that thinks women don't vote for women.
No, wait. You can't have it two ways.
I know.
You can't say Hillary won 2 million more votes than Trump, and then say people aren't voting for women. People voted for women. under the Electoral College system, she lost. That's it. It was nothing sexist. She won. She got the most votes. So Americans are willing to vote for a woman. You just have to win the states that you need to win. Had she won Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida, she would be president-elect. Win by the rules. There is no sexism in this election. She got the most votes. She just didn't win Electoral College.
That's a good point.
There is more sexism. I'm going to get in trouble for this one. There is more sexism than racism. How's that? So that will answer your question. I'll leave it there.
Oh my God, we agree.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Diana Tavera, I attend Hostos Community College. I have two questions. The first question is, do you think Trump is going to follow on his plan with the undocumented immigrant? And what do you think the impact of the election will be on higher education policy?
Well, the second question is very difficult.
Very.
But I think there's signs already that he's going to be a little bit more rational than on the undocumented. He's not talking about kicking out 12 million people. He's basically talking about the Obama program.
The Obama
of
program.
Of the last six.
He's going to do exactly what the president did, which is follow the law.
So, I mean,
this president has
right.
deported more people
than anybody else.
than any all combined past four presidents, I think it is. So he's going to follow the law. Donald Trump doesn't need to do anything. Follow the law just as President Obama did. And people that are on his side will understand it. I think he's not going to build that wall he says he's going to build. He's just going to die on that one.
But he has, by his rhetoric, because elections count and language counts, he has kind of poisoned the well and certainly in how undocumented people feel in terms of their personal safety. We only have a minute left, so please ask a very quick question.
Hi, my name is Carmine. I'm a Sikh student at Queens College, and I was wondering, what do you think is going to happen to CUNY universities regarding their sanctuary status?
Well, that's very interesting. That's a very interesting. I mean, the sanctuary. Trump raised the question, didn't say, but that. Maybe if cities remain as sanctuary cities, we will cut them off from federal aid. We only got a very, very.
I briefly say that we have to start worrying about what our governor Cuomo is doing with CUNY. Let's start there.
Okay,
so he may be setting.
Right.
So right there, Cuomo is picking for some reason on CUNY campuses for some political Machiavellian reason. So let's worry about Governor Cuomo first before we worry about President Trump.
Agreed.
That's what I would say.
That's a perfect statement.
I would worry about a lot of things in public higher education, and I think that there are any number of reasons to think that the way in which we've understood public universities is going to greatly change over the next 4 years. I think the vision that has dominated the country in the past is eroding, and I think that the people who are going to be chosen to run federal higher education policy will not be committed. We're running
out of time. I think that we've learned that elections do matter, and this one. We're about to see how it matters. Yeah. Thank you all. We'll see you next time on CUNY Forum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.